On July the 8th, 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, for the final time. This event marked the end of NASA's 30-year shuttle program.
The shuttle's always going to be a reflection of what a great nation can do when it dares to be bold and commits to follow through. We're not ending the journey today, Mike. We're completing a chapter of a journey that will never end. You and the thousands of men and women who gave their hearts, souls, and their lives for the cause of exploration have rewritten history. Let's light this fire one more time, Mike, and witness this great nation at its best. The crew of Atlantis is ready for launch.
While 2011 brings an end to NASA's shuttle program, it also marks the 50th anniversary of one of NASA's first manned space flights. On board was a man who would become a local hero, Virgil Ivan Gus Grissom. Today, on the 50th anniversary of Gus's first trip into space, it is his hometown of Mitchell that celebrates and recognises his achievements in spaceflight.
It is a 3-day event honoring Gus Grissom and making sure that future generations know all about Gus and everything he has done for space exploration and everything that he has done and given back to Lawrence County.
We thought that this was an excellent opportunity. This celebration, the 50th anniversary, would bring attention back to Gus, to Lawrence County, and to the space program.
Gus Grissom was born in the small town of Mitchell, Indiana, on April 3, 1926. He spent his early life here with his parents and 3 siblings.
Gus came from an average working class family in Mitchell, Indiana. And although Gus grew up during the height of the Great Depression, when a lot of Hoosiers were losing their job, his father was able to keep on to his. And although they weren't rich, they always had food on the table, clothes to wear.
Gus's early years in Mitchell are where his interest in flying began.
Well, Gus was always interested in airplanes from the time that he was able to take a ride in a plane when he was about 12 years old. And I think that sparked an interest in him that just never went away.
Being in the air stirred something in Gus. Perhaps it was his also ticket out of small town life. And whenever he could, he and his good friend Bill Head would head out to the Bedford Airport, which is nearby Mitchell, to try to cage rides in any kind of aircraft that were flying in and out of the airport. Well, of course, his military career started in the 1940s in World War II. He graduated from Mitchell High School near when the war was winding down in 1945. Went into the U.S. Army Air Corps, but never really got off the ground, was a file clerk at an airfield in Florida.
With no prospect of flying, Gus left the Army and mundane desk job that he had been assigned. He knew he would need more education than his time as a desk clerk in the Army gave him, so Gus decided to take a different course.
His education was what really brought him to where he was. And he always knew that going to school was probably the most important thing he could do.
When the war ended, decided that he would use some of the benefits of the GI Bill, went to Purdue University in West Lafayette and pursued a career as a mechanical engineer, got his degree there, and was kind of at loose ends after graduation, didn't know what he wanted to do with his newfound degree, and still had that itch to fly, so he joined the newly established U.S. Air Force.
This time, Gus was able to finish his training and received his pilot wings. Less than a year later, with the Korean War in full swing, he was sent into combat.
The Korean War was raging in the early 1950s. There was a bitter conflict on the ground, but in the air, American aircraft were superior to their North Korean opponents, the MiGs that they were flying. And Gus flew 100 combat missions, tour of duty in Korea. Never really got the chance to shoot down a MiG. He flew more as a wingman for some of the other pilots in his squadron, but was in the thick of the action, got shot at by his North Korean opponents, and survived and came back home.
The model of the Sabre jet that's hanging in our parents' house was built by Gus when he was waiting on his orders to go to Korea.
Charlie Walker and fellow Lawrence County astronaut Ken Bowersox made the long trip to Mitchell to take part in the events. The two primarily came to speak at a luncheon that was hosted in nearby Bedford and to recognise a man that proved that they too could reach for the stars.
In 1959, I was just in grade school, last year in grade school, but I remember when the announcement of the original 7 astronauts, of course they weren't the original 7 then, they were the astronauts. And I can remember that my gosh, Gus Grissom, Mitchell, Indiana.
I didn't run around telling everybody, hey, I want to be an astronaut someday, because usually folks would think you're kind of crazy. But the folks that I did tell, my counselors, teachers, what I remember them saying was, well, that's possible. Gus Grissom did it.
After returning to the United States, Gus and his family moved to Texas. He began working at Bryan Air Force Base as a flight instructor, where he made an impression on one of the students.
We had a luau at the Officers Club one evening, and being a student officer, we were allowed to attend. And Gus was dressed properly and won first prize for costume. And to let you know what his costume consisted of, it was a grass skirt down here with his hairy legs showing underneath, of course. A great big blonde wig that kind of covered his face and all the way down to his rear end. And then top it off with a great, pardon me ladies, great big built up upper torso that stuck out about like this with a great giant brassiere wrapped around him. On his back was a sign that said, "You dreamed I was shipwrecked in my maiden form bra." That's a true story, and I want everybody in the world to know that, because Gus had one whale of a sense of humor, a super person, and I'm just proud as hell to be able to say I knew Gus Grissom.
A short while later, Gus transferred to the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for additional education. After his program ended, he took on the dangerous task of training at the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Well, I think my mother was a little concerned about that aspect of it, but Gus probably would have done it regardless. So that was what he wanted to do. That was his desire to become a test pilot, and he directed all of his training toward that end.
He always, I think, wanted to take that next step. He wanted to join the Air Force and become a pilot. He did that. The next step would be to be involved in war, to test out what he had learned through his training. He achieved that. He went on to become a test pilot, to join that fraternity, did well. And when he was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, testing out supersonic planes like the F-105 Starfighter, the American space program came into being, and that was the next step on the ladder of his career.
A year after returning to Wright-Patterson as a test pilot, Gus received a message that was classified as top secret. It instructed Gus to report to Washington, D.C. on an appointed day. It was this message that would change Gus's life.
Test pilots were going to be the ones used to become astronauts. They went through the records. There were more than 500 qualified test pilots. That list was winnowed down to a few hundred. They were sent for testing at various installations around the United States, including the Lovelace Clinic out west, where there were a lot of invasive medical tests taken of these potential astronaut candidates. And finally, they winnowed it down to 7 astronauts.
The nation's Project Mercury astronauts are here after a long and perhaps unprecedented series of evaluations which told our medical consultants and scientists of their superb adaptability to their coming flight. Which of these men will be first to orbit the Earth, I cannot tell you. He won't know himself until the day of the flight.
I'm Virgil I. Grissom from Mitchell, Indiana. Oh, my career...
How old are you, Mitchell?
33.
I didn't say.
My career has been serving a nation, serving the country, and here's another opportunity where they need my talents, and I'm most grateful for an opportunity to serve in this capacity.
I don't think we were surprised that he was selected. Of course, I don't think we also knew that there were 508 military test pilots that had been picked as prospects for the first astronauts.
I think that seemed like a natural evolution. That's where he ought to go. I mean, he was already testing airplanes and doing that. That just seemed like the natural evolution.
After being selected as one of the first 7 astronauts, Gus started down the path that would get him into space. The men spent countless hours preparing and training to make sure their launches went smoothly. The success of these suborbital flights was crucial to the future of the space program and tested whether or not a manned flight could be sent to the moon. It was announced that Alan Shepard would be the first American in space, but Gus was right behind him to become the second. On July 21st, 1961, Gus's spacecraft, the Mercury Redstone 4, known as the Liberty Bell 7, launched Gus into space. Every part of Gus's 15-minute and 37-second flight had gone according to plan, until splashdown.
And Gus was lying there waiting to be picked up by the recovery helicopter, and things seemed to be going well. He was marking down various switch positions to give to scientists back at NASA after the flight was over, lying on his back, minding his own business, waiting for the helicopter to latch on to the capsule. He would then hit an igniter switch that would blow off the hatch that sealed it from the outside water. He was lying there, minding his own business, as he told NASA officials, when he heard a dull thud and the hatch blew off prematurely due to some mechanical malfunction. Seawater immediately started rushing into the spacecraft. Gus said he never moved as fast in his life as he did then, so he exited the capsule very quickly and soon found himself floating in the Atlantic Ocean up to his armpits. The Marine helicopter did manage to hook on to the Mercury spacecraft, but because of a warning light in the helicopter's cockpit, they thought they would have to, they might even crash. So they had to jettison the Liberty Bell 7, and it sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So while this was going on and this helicopter crew was wrestling with the Liberty Bell 7 capsule, poor Gus was kind of forgotten for a bit and found himself sinking lower and lower in the water. Water was getting into his spacesuit. The rotor wash from the helicopter blades was blowing water over him, and he thought he might drown. Thankfully, another helicopter threw down a horse collar that he swam very fast to, as fast as he could, and he was winched up into the helicopter and taken back to the recovery aircraft carrier.
Once the Mercury flights were over, Gus began helping to develop the first capsule that would carry 2 men into space. His experience in mechanical engineering and as a test pilot helped him significantly in the development. Alan Shepard was slated to become the commander of the first Gemini flight. However, due to a sudden sickness, Shepard was unable to pilot the spacecraft. Gus had been his backup, and now he would become the first man to go into space twice. Following the tradition of naming space vehicles, Gus chose a name that he thought quite fitting, but NASA wasn't so sure.
Gus said, you know, I'm getting a lot of kidding and chiding for being sensitive about my Liberty Bell 7 mission. So let's make a little fun of it. He turned to a name from a popular musical at that time, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, about a real-life character from history who survived the sinking of the Titanic. So Gus decided, well, here's one way to get, tell people I'm not really sensitive about this, and they decided to name the spacecraft the Molly Brown. Well, NASA officials didn't think this was a proper and dignified name for an American spacecraft, and they asked Gus to change it. So he said, okay, how about the Titanic? Well, compared to that, the Molly Brown was fine with them.
On March 23, 1965, Gemini 3 launched with Gus and fellow astronaut John Young aboard.
There goes the pitch. Roger pitch. On your way, Molly Brown.
The flight was just shy of 5 hours and made 3 revolutions of the Earth. After his flight, Gus continued working on the Gemini program and was even training to be backup commander for Gemini 6 when he made the switch to the Apollo program. Gus would be the commander for the first Apollo flight, and he would be joined by Roger Chaffee and Ed White.
Deke Slayton, one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, was in charge of astronaut selection for the various missions. And if all possible, he and other NASA officials wanted to have, if they were still in the program, one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts perhaps be the first man to walk on the moon, to meet President John F. Kennedy's goal of, before the decade was out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And Gus was really the only one of the original 7 still around, still dedicated to the program. So he was selected to test out the new Apollo spacecraft, which would take 3 astronauts around the Earth and to the moon and back. There were a lot of glitches and problems with this new spacecraft, of course. It was something new, a spacecraft that would have to take astronauts to thousands of miles to the moon and back on a 14-day mission. There was also a new spacecraft company building the Apollo command module, North American Aviation in California. And the astronauts, because the program was so big, there were so many contractors involved, didn't have that connection they had with McDonnell earlier on the Gemini and the Mercury programs. Didn't have that connection with the engineers. Didn't really have much say in the design and what was right and what was wrong about the spacecraft. And that was a big concern to Gus and a lot of the other astronauts. One of the simulators that they would use to train for the mission kept falling further and further behind, and with all the changes going on in the design and construction of the Apollo command module, so much so that Gus took a lemon from his house in Houston and hung it in the simulator to show his disdain for what a lemon of a spacecraft it was. And on January 27, 1967, all these problems turned tragic. The 3 astronauts were at Pad 34 at Cape Kennedy, and testing out the spacecraft, plugs out test it was called, to see if the Apollo 1 could operate on its own internal power. There were a lot of delays during this test mission of the Apollo 1, a lot of problems in communications back and forth with controllers on the ground in the blockhouse, just not that far away. And Gus was really perturbed about this. He said, if we can't talk to each other here on the ground, how are we going to talk to each other when you're here and we're on the way to the moon? And there were a lot of holds involved in the test that day. And somewhere in the spacecraft, in the many miles of wiring in that spacecraft, insulation had been scraped off. There was a spark, and because of the pure oxygen atmosphere under pressure in the spacecraft, that fire that spread wildly throughout the spacecraft. There were officials, on the ground who tried to get the astronauts out, but they were too late. The fire had cut through their air hoses, and the very poisonous gases that were created from this fire asphyxiated astronauts, and they were killed.
As part of the events, a memorial service held almost exactly 50 years from the date of Gus's first flight into space celebrates the life of a hometown hero. People have come together to recognise his achievements and sacrifices he made to further our knowledge of space.
The Apollo fire being as bad as it was, it still made it safe for 12 other men to go to the moon and land and return back to Earth safely. And if that fire had it happened maybe in a different place, like on a flight, there might have been more serious repercussions as far as the space program, the Apollo program went. Of course, that's the death of 3 great astronauts, but in itself, that's very important because we did take people to the moon and return them safely.
The safety of crew and the safety of mission became more and more in sharp focus because of the loss of Gus Grissom and crew in Apollo 1.
As the events of the past 3 days wind down, families visit Spring Mill State Park, where the Grissom Memorial Museum stands.
Having such a special tribute to Gus in Mitchell, it reminds people, one, of the space program, I think, in general. And as generations grow up and new kids come to visit and travel with their families, they can learn.
I think it's probably the most important thing for Indiana as a state, especially this area.
I'd like to see Lieutenant Colonel Virgil I. Gus Grissom remembered as an individual who saw a future and went after it, realized the risk, accepted the risk, and unfortunately paid the price, as pioneers in our history so often have.
And I think that having that memorial at Spring Mill really just is an outstanding opportunity for all the people that travel through the state park.
We have other astronauts from this neighborhood, and that speaks very strongly to all these kids that grow up here.
You can get a lot of honors, but when your friends and your neighbors want to honor you, I think that would have been something that Gus would have been tremendously proud of.
He was a very simple man. He did not seek the limelight.
A person from a small town in Indiana who had big dreams and wasn't afraid of big challenges.
I think he probably realized he had the best job in the world, and I think he made the most out of it.
I would say that Gus is a true Hoosier success story, and someone who used all of his talents to their utmost, and someone who we should all look to as an example.
Gus Grissom is a true Hoosier hero. His efforts and sacrifices in space flight helped to make the Apollo 11 landing and Neil Armstrong's iconic first steps on the moon possible. Because of efforts by groups and dedicated individuals, and the monuments and memorials that can be found in Lawrence County and around the globe, it is certain that Gus Grissom's legacy is sure to live on for generations to come.